I knew something was wrong the moment my mother didn't look at me when she spoke. We were standing in my parents' living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that usually smelled like coffee and old furniture and habits no one questioned anymore. My father sat in his recliner, hands folded on his stomach, eyes fixed on the muted television. My younger brother Nathan leaned against the doorway, scrolling on his phone, pretending not to listen. My mother cleared her throat and said, almost gently, "We've already handled the paperwork. There's nothing for you to worry about." That sentence landed harder than if she'd yelled. Nothing for you to worry about. Not "we talked about it," not "we want your opinion." Just a clean erasure of my right to choose. I was 31 years old enough to understand exactly what was happening, young enough that they still assumed I would accept it. My name is Claire Holloway, and that afternoon was the first time I understood that the love I'd been raised to believe in was never unconditional. It was transactional. As long as I stayed quiet, helpful, agreeable, I belonged. The moment I didn't, I was inconvenient. "What paperwork?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. My mother adjusted the cuff of her cardigan, still avoiding my eyes. "The trust, your grandmother's estate. We finalized everything last week." I felt a faint pressure behind my eyes. Not tears, just clarity, sharpening into something cold. "You finalized it without me?" I asked. My father shifted in his chair. "We didn't want to burden you. You've always had so much on your plate." That familiar justification. "You're strong. You'll be fine. We decided for you." I nodded slowly. And what was decided? This time, my mother did look at me. Her expression was carefully neutral, the way people look when they've rehearsed disappointment but don't want to be accused of cruelty. "The house stays in the family," she said. "The business assets go to Nathan. It's cleaner that way." Cleaner. My brother finally glanced up from his phone. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before he looked away again. He didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. "And me?" I asked. My mother sighed. "Claire, don't make this harder than it needs to be." There it was, the first cut. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't demand to see documents or threaten lawyers. I simply stood there, absorbing the reality that had been constructed without me. My grandmother, Eleanor Holloway, had died 3 months earlier. She'd built a modest but profitable catering company from the ground up, one she ran well into her 70s. I'd spent my 20s helping her expand it, modernize systems, negotiate contracts. I'd delayed moving out of state because she asked me to stay. Because family mattered. At least, I thought it did. "We assumed you'd understand," my mother continued. "Nathan needs stability. You're independent. You always have been." Independent. Another word for expendable. I looked at my brother again. He shifted uncomfortably. "Did Grandma know about this?" I asked. My father answered too quickly. "She trusted us." That wasn't an answer. I picked up my coat from the chair and slipped it on, my movements slow and deliberate. No one tried to stop me. At the door, I turned back. "I won't interfere," I said calmly. "But don't mistake silence for agreement." My mother frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I replied, "that I'm paying attention." I left before anyone could respond. That night, alone in my apartment, I replayed the conversation in my head. Not angrily, precisely. Every word, every omission, every way they'd spoken around me instead of to me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. And decisions have consequences. I opened my laptop and searched for something I'd never imagined needing. Estate attorney. Trust disputes. Undue influence. I wasn't planning revenge. Not yet. I was planning to understand what had been taken from me and how quietly it had happened. Because the most dangerous betrayal isn't loud. It's the kind that smiles at you and says, "We already handled it." And as I stared at the screen, one thought settled in with unsettling calm. If they had gone this far without me, then whatever came next wouldn't be about asking for my place back. It would be about deciding whether I wanted it at all. The first week after that conversation passed without a single follow-up call. No clarification, no reassurance, no message checking if I was okay. That silence told me more than any argument ever could. I went back to my routine. Work during the day, long walks in the evening, cooking meals I barely tasted. On the surface, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had shifted. Once you realize you've been excluded on purpose, you stop assuming good intentions. You start watching patterns. On Thursday afternoon, my Aunt Marlene called. She was my mother's younger sister, the one who had always hovered on the edge of family matters without fully committing to any side. "Your mom said you took the trust news badly," she said carefully. I almost smiled. Taken badly, as if I'd spilled a drink, not lost my place in my own family's future. "What news exactly?" I asked. There was a pause. "That you weren't interested in the business anyway." There it was, the revised narrative already spreading. "I was never asked," I said calmly. Marlene exhaled. I figured. She hesitated, then added, "Your grandmother talked about you a lot toward the end. More than they like to admit." That was the first crack. I didn't press her. I thanked her and hung up. If there was something to uncover, it wouldn't come from confrontation. It would come from patience. The following Monday, I made an appointment with an attorney named Samuel Price. Mid-40s, soft-spoken, the kind of man who listened more than he talked. His office was downtown, overlooking a courthouse that had seen thousands of family disputes disguised as legal procedures. I laid everything out. My role in the company, my grandmother's health, the sudden trust finalization, my exclusion. Samuel didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back slightly. "Do you know when the trust was amended?" "No," I said. "They won't tell me." He nodded. "That's common." "Is it legal?" I asked. "Sometimes," he replied. "Not always." He explained undue influence in plain terms. How power dynamics matter. How timing matters. How silence from one beneficiary can be engineered by withholding information. "You don't sound emotional," he observed. "I'm not," I said. "I'm focused." That earned me a small nod. "I'll need documents," he said. "Medical records, trust language, any correspondence from your grandmother." "I don't have access to any of that," I replied. He folded his hands. "Then we request it." Something about the word request made me uneasy. It sounded polite, temporary. "What if they refuse?" I asked. "Then it becomes interesting," he said. When I left his office, I didn't feel empowered. I felt grounded. There's a difference. 2 days later, my brother Nathan called me. He never called unless something was wrong. "Mom says you hired a lawyer," he said without greeting. "I consulted one," I replied. "Why?" he snapped. "You said you wouldn't interfere." "I said I wouldn't interfere," I corrected. "I didn't say I wouldn't protect myself." "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said. "It's just paperwork." Paperwork determines who has power, I thought. But I didn't say it. "Nathan," I said instead, "did you know about the trust before Grandma died?" Silence. That told me everything. "She wanted it this way," he finally said. "Did she tell you that herself?" I asked. Another pause, shorter this time. "Dad handled it," he said. "Why does that matter?" "Because it means you never questioned it," I thought. "Because it means you benefited without asking how." "It matters," I said quietly, "because one day you'll realize how easily it could have been you." He scoffed. "You're being dramatic." "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe you're being comfortable." He hung up on me. That evening, I went through old emails on my laptop. Messages from my grandmother asking me to review contracts, to sit in on vendor calls, to explain things she didn't trust anyone else to handle. In one message, dated just 4 months before her death, she'd written, "Thank you for always having my back. I don't know what I'd do without you." I stared at that line for a long time. If you trusted me that much, why would she cut me out entirely? She wouldn't. Which meant someone else had spoken for her. The next day, Samuel emailed me. He'd sent a formal request for documentation related to the trust and estate. A standard step. Neutral language, legally sound. By Friday, my mother called. Her voice was tight, controlled. "Why are lawyers involved?" she asked. "I want transparency," I said. "You don't trust us?" she replied, wounded. I almost laughed. Almost. "You made a major decision without me," I said. "Trust requires participation." She sighed heavily. "You're creating unnecessary conflict." "No," I said evenly. "I'm responding to it." She lowered her voice. "Your father is very upset." That was supposed to matter to me. "Then maybe he should explain himself," I replied. Silence. When the call ended, I realized something important. No one had asked how I felt. They were only concerned with how my actions made them uncomfortable. That night, Samuel sent another message. They had acknowledged receipt of the request. They were reviewing options. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange sense of calm. This was no longer about inheritance. It was about agency, about realizing that for years I'd been positioned as the reliable one so others could avoid responsibility, that my independence had been used as justification for exclusion. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If I walked away now, quietly, they'd rewrite the story until I disappeared completely. If I stayed silent, they'd call it maturity, but silence had already cost me enough. As I drifted toward sleep, one final thought surfaced, sharp and unmistakable. They believed this chapter was closed. They were wrong. It was just beginning. The documents arrived in a thin envelope with my father's return address, typed too carefully, as if precision could soften what was inside. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on my kitchen table for a full day, next to my laptop and a cup of coffee that went cold. There was a time when receiving anything from my parents would have triggered anxiety, a reflexive need to explain myself, to stay aligned. Now, it triggered something else. Distance. When I finally broke the seal, the contents were exactly what Samuel had predicted. A copy of the trust, a summary of assets, no medical records, no correspondence, no explanation for why the trust had been amended when it was, and one sentence that made my jaw tighten. Claire has been previously compensated for her contributions. Previously compensated, as if years of work, loyalty, and postponed life choices could be reduced to a line item. As if compensation were something that happened to you, not something you agreed to. I forwarded everything to Samuel without comment. He called me an hour later. "They're setting a narrative," he said, "that your role was transactional, that your exclusion was fair. Is that going to hold?" I asked. "That depends," he replied, "on what they don't want us to see." The phrase stayed with me long after we hung up. The following week, I drove past my grandmother's old catering facility for the first time since the funeral. The sign was still there, though the lights were off. A moving truck was parked out front. The business, it seemed, was already being absorbed into something else. I parked across the street and watched two men carry stainless steel equipment toward the truck. Equipment I'd helped purchase. Contracts I'd negotiated. Systems I'd built so my grandmother could slow down without losing control. I didn't feel anger. I felt erased. That night, I received a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Elena Ruiz. She'd been my grandmother's office manager for nearly a decade before retiring early. Sharp, observant, not easily intimidated. "Your Aunt Marlene mentioned you might be asking questions," the message read. "If you want to talk, I remember more than they think." We met the next morning at a quiet diner just outside town. Elena looked exactly the same. Same posture, same assessing gaze. "I don't want drama," she said as soon as we sat down. "But I won't lie. I'm not asking you to," I replied. She stirred her coffee slowly. "Your grandmother was frustrated near the end. Not confused, frustrated." That word landed with weight. "She felt sidelined," Elena continued. "Your father started handling things without looping her in. Said it was easier, less stress." "Did she agree?" I asked. Elena shook her head. She complained to me. Said she felt rushed into signing things she hadn't had time to review. My fingers curled slightly around my mug. "Did she mention the trust?" I asked. "Yes," Elena said. "She said it didn't reflect what she wanted, that she trusted you, but didn't want to upset your parents by pushing back." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. That was my grandmother, avoiding conflict to protect people who didn't protect her in return. "Did she ever say she wanted me excluded?" I asked. Elena didn't hesitate. No, that was enough. When I left the diner, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved. Back at home, I typed everything out while it was still fresh. Dates, words, context. I sent it to Samuel with a simple note. "This matters." He replied within minutes. "It does." The next step was unavoidable. He filed a petition for discovery, not a lawsuit, not a public accusation. A legal request compelling disclosure of documents related to the trust amendment, including medical evaluations and communications between my father and the attorney who drafted it. That's when the tone changed. My mother called that night. Her voice was brittle. "You're forcing our hand." "I didn't," I replied. "I asked for transparency." "This is tearing the family apart," she said. I leaned against the counter, steady. "It was already torn," I said. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't." She lowered her voice. "Your brother is very upset." "I imagine he is," I replied. "You don't understand what you're risking," she continued. "If this goes to court—" "I understand exactly what I'm risking," I interrupted. "Do you?" There was silence on the other end. Not reflective silence. Defensive silence. "We raised you better than this," she said finally. I almost laughed. "You raised me to be responsible," I said. "That's what I'm being." I hung up before she could respond. The next morning, my brother showed up at my apartment, unannounced. He stood in the doorway, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes darting around like he was waiting for backup. "You're really doing this?" he said. "Yes," I replied. "Why?" he demanded. "What do you want? Money? Control?" I studied him. The entitlement, the fear underneath it. "I want the truth," I said. "And I want my choices back." He scoffed. "You're acting like we betrayed you." "You did," I replied calmly. He shook his head. "You always make things complicated." "No," I said. "I make them visible." He left without another word. That afternoon, Samuel called again. "They're requesting mediation," he said. "Before disclosure." "Why?" I asked. "Because once documents are produced, they can't be unseen," he replied. I looked out the window at the street below. Ordinary people going about ordinary lives, unaware of how many family wars were being fought quietly behind closed doors. "Do we agree?" I asked. He paused. "That's your choice." I thought of my grandmother, of Elena's words, of the sentence, previously compensated. "Yes," I said, "but on my terms." When the call ended, I felt something settle into place. For the first time since my grandmother's death, I wasn't reacting. I was directing. And whatever happened next, whether it ended in settlement or court, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not be managed into silence again. Mediation was scheduled for the following Thursday, in a glass-walled office building overlooking the river. Neutral ground, Samuel called it. A place designed to feel calm while people negotiated things they'd never say out loud at home. I arrived early. Not out of nerves, but habit. When you've spent years being the responsible one, punctuality becomes muscle memory. My parents arrived together. My mother's mouth was set in a tight line. My father avoided eye contact. Nathan came separately, 10 minutes late, irritated before he even sat down. The mediator, a woman named Ruth Callahan, introduced herself and explained the process in a measured voice. Confidential, voluntary, non-binding. The kind of language meant to reassure everyone that no one was losing control. That was ironic, considering why we were there. "We're here to resolve misunderstandings," Ruth began. Samuel didn't correct her. Neither did I. My father spoke first. "Claire has always been independent," he said, hands folded. "We assumed she wouldn't want to be tied down by the business." Assumed. Again. Ruth turned to me. "Is that accurate?" "No," I said simply. Nathan shifted in his chair. "You never said you wanted it." I looked at him. "You never asked." "That's not fair," my mother said sharply. "You could have spoken up." "I did," I replied. "For years. You just didn't hear it because it didn't inconvenience you." The room went quiet. Ruth cleared her throat. "Let's focus on specifics. Claire, what outcome are you seeking?" I didn't hesitate. "I want the trust amendment reviewed," I said. "I want access to the documents that led to my exclusion. And I want the record corrected to reflect my actual role." My father frowned. "This is about money." "No," I said. "It's about authorship. You rewrote my story without me." Nathan scoffed. "You're acting like we stole something." "You did," I replied calmly. "You took my right to decide." Ruth raised a hand gently. "Let's take a break." We were separated into different rooms. In ours, Samuel leaned toward me. "They're defensive. That's expected." "I'm not here to be understood," I said. "I'm here to be documented." He nodded. "Good." When we reconvened, my mother spoke again, her voice softer now. "We did what we thought was best for the family," she said. "For the structure," I replied. "Not the people." My father's jaw tightened. You don't know how hard this was for us. I met his gaze. You didn't know how hard it was for me. You didn't ask. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, subtly. Ruth looked down at her notes. Mr. Holloway, did Eleanor ever express concern about Claire's role in the business? My father hesitated. That hesitation stretched too long. She trusted us, he said finally. That wasn't the question, Ruth replied. Silence. Nathan leaned forward. Why are we rehashing the past? Grandma is gone. The decisions are made. Then why are you afraid of the documents? I asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The mediation ended without resolution. That was expected. What wasn't expected was the email Samuel received the next morning. They had agreed to partial disclosure. Medical records. A limited set of communications. Enough to appear cooperative, not enough to reveal intent. Samuel called me immediately. They're trying to control the damage, he said. What does that tell you? I asked. That there's more, he replied. The documents arrived in batches over the next week. Evaluations showing my grandmother was still competent when the trust was amended. Emails between my father and the estate attorney discussing timelines and urgency. Language about simplifying succession. About minimizing conflict. And one line that made my chest tighten. Claire will adapt. She always does. I stared at the screen. That sentence wasn't about love. It was about expectation. The expectation that I would absorb discomfort so others wouldn't have to. I forwarded everything to Samuel. He replied with 2 words. We proceed. That evening, Nathan called me. Not angry this time. Uneasy. They're talking about selling the business, he said. Mom's panicking. I said nothing. They wouldn't do that if you hadn't stirred things up, he added. I closed my eyes briefly. They're doing that because the foundation was never stable, I replied. I just stopped holding it together. He was quiet. Claire, he said finally, what happens if this blows back on all of us? I answered honestly. Then we'll all have to live with the truth. When the call ended, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Because for the first time, the consequences were no longer mine alone. They belonged to everyone who had made decisions in my absence. A few days later, Samuel filed a formal motion, not for money, for review. Judicial oversight of the trust amendment process. That single filing changed everything. It meant a judge would look at timelines, at competence, at influence. It meant my father would have to answer questions under oath. It meant my mother's carefully curated version of harmony would no longer be enough. And as I sat alone that night, reviewing the documents one more time, I understood something with startling clarity. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. I wasn't taking anything from them. I was taking back the authorship of my own life. And whatever came next, whether it ended in settlement or exposure, one thing was already certain. The silence they depended on was gone. And without it, their version of the family could not survive. The judge scheduled the preliminary hearing for mid-May. Not a trial, not a verdict, just a review to determine whether the trust amendment process warranted deeper examination. On paper, it sounded procedural. In reality, it was the first time someone outside our family would officially question the story my parents had been telling for months. That alone was enough to unsettle them. The calls started almost immediately. My mother left a voicemail, asking if we could talk privately, without lawyers. My father emailed Samuel directly, suggesting an amicable resolution. Nathan texted twice in one day, both messages unsentimental and clipped. We need to figure this out. This is getting out of hand. I didn't respond to any of it, not because I was angry, because I was done negotiating my reality with people who had already decided it for me. Instead, I focused on preparation. Samuel walked me through what to expect. The judge would want clarity, dates, roles, intent. My job was not to persuade emotionally, but to answer precisely, to resist the urge to explain more than was asked. They'll try to frame you as resentful, he warned. The best counter is calm. That part came easily. What didn't come easily was the waiting. When you're used to solving problems, waiting feels like paralysis. But this wasn't a problem to fix. It was a process to allow. Every document, every delayed response from my parents, every careful non-answer only added weight to the question already forming in the judge's mind. Why was Claire excluded? A week before the hearing, my Aunt Marlene asked to meet. We chose a small park near her house. She brought coffee. She always did, as if caffeine could soften discomfort. I should have spoken up sooner, she said, not looking at me. You can speak now, I replied. She nodded. Your mother and father were always worried you'd challenge them. Not intentionally, just by existing. That surprised me. They thought if you had ownership, you'd question things, she continued. Demand accountability. I smiled faintly. I already did. For years, she sighed. They didn't see it that way. What did Grandma say to you? I asked. Marlene hesitated, then answered quietly. She said you were the only one who asked her what she wanted, instead of telling her what was best. That sentence stayed with me long after we parted. The night before the hearing, I slept surprisingly well, not because I was confident of the outcome, but because I knew I'd already crossed the hardest line. I had chosen to stand in the open rather than be quietly managed in the dark. The courthouse was smaller than I expected. Brick exterior, narrow hallways. The kind of place where life-altering decisions happened without spectacle. My parents arrived separately. My mother wore a careful smile. My father looked strained. Nathan didn't come at all. Samuel squeezed my shoulder lightly before we went in. Answer only what's asked, he reminded me. The judge, a woman in her early 60s, reviewed the file without looking at us at first. When she did, her gaze lingered on me just a second longer than on my parents. Miss Holloway, she said, I'd like you to describe your role in your grandmother's business prior to her passing. I answered calmly, succinctly, no embellishment. She nodded and turned to my father. Mr. Holloway, why was your daughter excluded from the trust amendment? My father cleared his throat. We believed it was in everyone's best interest. Based on what? The judge asked. He hesitated. Again, the judge made a note. That was it. No ruling that day. No declaration. But when the hearing ended, Samuel leaned toward me. She saw it, he said quietly. Now it's just a matter of time. Outside the courthouse, my mother approached me. You didn't have to go this far, she said, voice tight. I met her. She looked away. 2 days later, Samuel called. They've requested settlement discussions, he said. Formal ones. I closed my eyes. On what terms? I asked. Recognition, he replied. Correction of the record. And compensation tied to your documented contributions. Not ownership, but acknowledgement. The first, real one. I thought of my grandmother, of Elena, of Marlene, of every moment I'd swallow discomfort to keep the peace. Yes, I said. We'll listen. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city quiet outside my window. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was bracing for impact. I felt like I was standing still while the truth did its work. And I understood something I'd never allowed myself to admit before. Walking away quietly would have been easier, but choosing myself was cleaner. And no matter how this ended, I would never again confuse being adaptable with being disposable. The settlement meeting was scheduled for a Friday morning, intentionally early, as if everyone wanted it over with before they had time to change their minds. Samuel and I arrived first. The room was smaller than the mediation space, windowless, practical. No attempt at comfort. Just a long table, legal pads, bottled water no one would drink. My parents came in together this time. My mother's shoulders were tense, her posture too upright. My father looked older than he had a week earlier, his movement slower, as if the process itself had begun to weigh on him physically. Nathan wasn't there. That absence wasn't accidental. Samuel leaned toward me and spoke quietly. They're trying to contain this. Fewer voices, less unpredictability. I nodded. The opposing attorney, a man named Harold Kent, opened with careful phrasing about preserving dignity, minimizing harm, and finding common ground. Words meant to smooth the edges of what had already cut deep. We're prepared to acknowledge, Harold said, that Claire's contributions to the business were substantial and not adequately reflected in the amended trust. I kept my expression neutral. My mother exhaled sharply, as if the admission physically pained her. Samuel responded calmly. Acknowledgement is a starting point, not a resolution. Harold nodded. Of course. We're proposing a corrective filing to the trust record, along with a compensation structure tied to documented revenue growth during Ms. Holloway's operational tenure. There it was. Compensation. Measurable. Containable. My father finally spoke. "We never intended to hurt you," he said, looking directly at me for the first time in weeks. I didn't respond. Intent wasn't the issue. Impact was. Samuel slid a document across the table. "This outlines our counterproposal." Harold reviewed it silently. My mother watched his face, searching for signs of damage. The counterproposal was simple. A formal correction filed with the probate court, stating that my exclusion was procedural, not reflective of merit or intent. A public acknowledgement of my role as operational lead. A financial settlement tied to valuation at the time of amendment. And a clause that mattered most to me: no ongoing obligations, no advisory role, no consulting expectation, no family leverage disguised as reconciliation. Harold looked up. "This is extensive." "It's precise," Samuel replied. My mother shook her head slightly. "Why do you need all this in writing?" I answered before Samuel could. "Because silence is how this happened," I said. "I'm not leaving room for reinterpretation." My father stared at the table. "If we agree to this," he said slowly, "it ends everything." I considered his words. "Yes," I replied. "That's the point." The meeting ended without signatures. But this time, there was no tension in the air when we stood. Just gravity. 2 days later, Nathan showed up at my apartment again. He looked different, less defensive, more tired. "They're going to accept," he said without preamble. "I know," I replied. He paced the living room, restless. "You didn't have to push this far." I watched him carefully. I didn't push. I stopped absorbing. He ran a hand through his hair. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to them?" I answered honestly. "Yes. And I know what not doing it did to me." He stopped pacing. "Do you hate us?" he asked. The question surprised me. "No," I said after a moment. "I don't trust you." He swallowed. "Yes," I replied. He nodded slowly, as if accepting something he couldn't change. "They're selling the catering company," he said. "Once this is done." I felt a flicker of something. Not sadness. Finality. "That was always going to happen," I said. "It just happened sooner because I stopped holding it together." He looked at me. "You really don't feel guilty, do you?" He left without another word. Every term. No edits. Samuel forwarded the email with a single line. They folded. The signing was scheduled for the following week. When the day came, I dressed simply. Not to make a statement, to avoid one. The papers were thick, the language dense. Each page represented a decision made in my absence, now being formally corrected. My mother didn't look at me. My father signed slowly, carefully, like someone writing a name they no longer recognized. When it was over, the room felt empty. Outside, Samuel turned to me. "Most people expect to feel victorious at this point," he said. "I don't," I replied. "That's healthy," he said. That evening, I went home and packed a box. Not to move, to remove. Old documents, family paperwork, things I'd held on to because they represented obligation, not meaning. At the bottom of a drawer, I found a birthday card my grandmother had given me years ago. Inside, she'd written, "You don't need permission to be whole." I sat on the floor and read that line again and again. For the first time, I understood it. The settlement wasn't revenge. It wasn't payback. It was a boundary, drawn in ink instead of emotion. And with it, something else became clear. The hardest part wasn't standing up to my family. It was accepting that they had never planned to stand beside me. Now that I knew that, the path forward felt quieter, cleaner. Whatever came next would be built without borrowed loyalty. And for the first time in my life, that felt like freedom. The first morning after the settlement was finalized, I woke up disoriented. Not because anything was wrong, but because nothing was pulling at me. No messages to answer. No emotional fallout to manage. No internal rehearsal of conversations I might need to have later. The silence felt unfamiliar, like waking up in a house after all the furniture has been moved out. Clean, echoing, honest. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, letting the realization settle. For the first time since my grandmother died, the story was no longer in motion. There were no more turns to anticipate. No more documents waiting to surface. The system had closed around the truth and moved on. I was the one who hadn't yet. That week, the catering company officially announced it was being acquired by a regional hospitality group. The name would change. Staff would be absorbed where possible. Operations consolidated. A clean ending, according to the press release. Nathan texted me the link. "They finalized the sale," he wrote. I didn't reply, not because I was avoiding him, but because there was nothing left to say. The business had survived on borrowed structure for years. Once I stepped back, its fragility had become visible to everyone, except the people who'd benefited most from ignoring it. I returned to my own work gradually. Consulting projects I'd paused while the legal process unfolded. New inquiries that had come in quietly. Referrals from people who'd watched how I handled myself and decided they wanted that steadiness near their own operations. One afternoon, I met with a potential client, a mid-sized family-owned food distributor. During the meeting, the owner, a man in his late 50s, said something that caught my attention. "We've been burned before," he admitted, by assuming loyalty was the same as alignment. I nodded. They're not the same thing. That sentence seemed to land harder than he expected. After the meeting, as I walked back to my car, I realized something uncomfortable. I was good at this now. Not just the work, the boundaries, the clarity, the ability to sit across from people and define terms without apology or explanation. That skill hadn't come from confidence. It had come from being erased. A few days later, my Aunt Marlene called again. "I heard you signed," she said. "Yes," I replied. "I wanted you to know," she continued. "Your mother hasn't been sleeping." I closed my eyes briefly. "Marlene," I said, "that's not something I can fix." "I know," she said quickly. "I just thought you should know." "I already do," I replied. I knew the moment she chose control over conversation. Marlene sighed. "I wish things had been different." "So do I," said, and meant it. That night, I dreamed about my grandmother for the first time since her funeral. She wasn't sick. She wasn't fragile. She was standing in her old kitchen, sleeves rolled up, watching me quietly as I worked. When I woke, I felt steadier than I had in months. Later that week, Samuel called. "Just checking in," he said. "You doing okay?" "I am," I replied, in a way that feels unfamiliar. He chuckled softly. "That's normal. You spent a long time operating under pressure. It takes a while to realize you don't have to anymore." "There's something I've been thinking about," I said. "Yes?" "I don't want this story to define me." He paused. "It doesn't. It trained you." That distinction mattered. On Friday evening, I went through my apartment with a box and made quiet decisions. Old family photos I didn't need to look at anymore. Documents I'd kept out of fear rather than relevance. Objects that carried obligation instead of memory. I didn't throw everything away, just the things that tethered me to a version of myself that no longer existed. At the bottom of the box, I found a small envelope addressed to me in my grandmother's handwriting. No stamp, no date. Inside was a single folded page. "Claire, if you're reading this, then something went wrong. I hope you didn't stay quiet to keep the peace. Peace that costs you your voice isn't peace at all." I sat on the floor for a long time after reading that. The following Sunday, my mother called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. "I won't keep you long," she said immediately. I waited. "I wanted to tell you," she continued, "that I understand now why you did what you did." I didn't respond right away. "Understanding doesn't undo it," I said finally. "I know," she replied. "I just didn't want you to think I never saw it." I closed my eyes. "I don't need you to see it now," I said. "I needed you to see it then." She didn't argue. We ended the call quietly. No resolution. No reconciliation. And surprisingly, that was enough. That evening, I walked through the city as the sun set, watching people hurry past with their own invisible burdens. I thought about how often women are taught to be flexible, adaptable, forgiving. How those traits are praised until they become tools used against us. I thought about how easily love turns into leverage when no one questions who holds the power. And I realized something that would have frightened me a year ago. Anger had been useful. It had gotten me here, but I didn't need it now. What I needed next was direction, because survival had turned into choice. And choice, once reclaimed, demands to be used. The first real test of my new boundaries came when nothing dramatic happened. No emergencies, no family crises, No sudden demands disguised as concern, just a quiet stretch of normal days. That's when I realized how deeply I'd been conditioned to expect disruption. To stay slightly tense, slightly alert, ready to step in. Calm had always felt temporary, like something borrowed. Now, it was mine. I filled my time deliberately, not to stay busy, but to stay intentional. I restructured my consulting work so I wasn't chasing every opportunity. I declined projects that required emotional labor without authority. I said no without explanation, and watched how often people accepted it without protest. That alone was revealing. One afternoon, while reviewing a contract draft, I noticed something that made me pause. A clause about decision-making authority. Shared responsibility, but final approval reserved for the founding family. I closed the document. I called the client. "This structure doesn't work for me," I said calmly. "If I'm accountable, I need authority." There was a pause on the line. "That's how we've always done it," the client replied. "I understand," I said. "Then I'm not the right fit." Another pause. Longer this time. "We can revise," he said finally. I smiled to myself after hanging up. That was the difference. Before, I would have adapted. Now, I chose. A week later, Nathan emailed me. Not a text, an email. Thoughtful, deliberate. He wrote about the sale closing, about how the new owners had asked questions he couldn't answer, about how much he hadn't realized he didn't know. "I thought inheriting meant being prepared," he wrote. "Turns out, it just meant being positioned." I read the email twice before replying. "I hope you figure out what you want," I wrote back, "not what was handed to you." He responded with a single line. "I'm trying." That was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. As summer approached, the settlement funds were deposited into my account. I didn't celebrate. I didn't splurge. I moved a portion into savings, invested another, and left the rest untouched. The money wasn't validation. The record was. The corrected filing sat quietly in the county archive now, stating plainly that my exclusion had not reflected my grandmother's intent or my contribution. Anyone who looked would see it. That mattered more than people realized. One evening, my Aunt Marlene invited me to dinner. "I don't want this to be awkward," she said. "Then don't make it symbolic," I replied. She laughed softly. Fair enough. Dinner was simple. No heavy conversation, no probing questions. Just food and weather and mutual respect. As I left, she touched my arm. "You broke a pattern," she said quietly. "Do you know how rare that is?" I thought about it on the drive home. Breaking a pattern doesn't look heroic from the inside. It looks lonely. It looks like being misunderstood. It looks like choosing uncertainty over familiarity. But it also looks like breathing freely for the first time. Later that night, I pulled out my grandmother's last note again, the one about peace and silence. I realized something then. She hadn't left me instructions. She'd left me permission. The permission to stop managing other people's comfort at my own expense. To stop mistaking endurance for love. To stop shrinking so others could feel secure. That realization sharpened my next decision. I changed my last name professionally, not legally, intentionally. I chose my grandmother's maiden name, Walker. Not because I was rejecting my parents, but because I was aligning myself with the person who had seen me clearly and trusted me without conditions. Claire Holloway became Claire Walker. The first time I introduced myself that way, it felt strange. Then, it felt right. When my mother noticed, she didn't comment. Nathan did. "I saw the name change," he wrote. "Does that mean you're done with us?" I considered my response carefully. "It means I'm done being defined by what I tolerate," I replied. He didn't answer. That fall, I received an invitation to speak at a small professional conference. Women-led businesses, family enterprises, succession planning. I hesitated before accepting, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to turn my experience into spectacle. In the end, I agreed on one condition. I wouldn't tell a story about blame. I would tell a story about structure. On stage, I spoke calmly, about how exclusion often hides behind politeness, about how betrayal doesn't always involve shouting, about how control often masquerades as care. The room was silent. Afterward, a woman approached me, her eyes tired. "I thought I was crazy," she said. Now I know I wasn't. That was when it fully sank in. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was a pattern many people lived inside, without language for it. And language, once given, changes things. As I drove home that night, I felt something shift again. Not anger, not relief, purpose. Because I hadn't just reclaimed my own agency. I'd learned how easily it can be taken, and how quietly it must be defended. And I knew the next chapter of my life wouldn't be about reacting to what I'd lost. It would be about choosing what I was willing to protect. The closer the year came to ending, the more clearly I could see the shape of my old life from a distance. Not with bitterness, with perspective. It's strange how patterns only become obvious once you're no longer trapped inside them. How things you once called normal start to look coordinated, rehearsed, intentional. I noticed it in small moments. Like the first Thanksgiving I spent away from my parents' house. No long table, no assigned seats, no quiet competition over who brought the best dish, or who had disappointed whom since last Christmas. I spent the day with friends instead, people who knew fragments of my story, but never asked me to compress it into something palatable. Someone burned the rolls. Someone else forgot the cranberry sauce. We laughed anyway. And halfway through the meal, it hit me. No one was monitoring my reactions. No one was watching to see if I'd step in, smooth things over, redirect tension. No one needed me to be anything other than present. That realization stayed with me longer than the holiday itself. A few days later, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. "This is Olivia Chen. We met briefly at the conference. I hope this isn't intrusive." I remembered her immediately. Mid-40s, quiet intensity. She'd sat in the front row and barely moved while I spoke. We met for coffee the following week. She told me she was part of a family-owned manufacturing company, second generation. Her parents still held majority control. Her younger brother was being positioned as successor, despite having little operational experience. "They tell me I'm indispensable," she said, "but somehow never essential." I nodded. The language was familiar. "I've been excluded from the updated will," she continued, quietly. No conversation, just done. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly. "What should I do?" she asked. I chose my words carefully. "Start documenting," I said. "Not to accuse, to clarify. And stop volunteering your silence." She exhaled, like someone finally allowed to set something down. "I thought revenge had to be loud," she said. "It doesn't," I replied. "It just has to be precise." That conversation stayed with me, not because it flattered me, because it reminded me how easily this could have been my entire life if I'd stayed. Meanwhile, the ripples from my own situation continued quietly. The new owners of the catering company began restructuring almost immediately. Systems were audited. Roles were clarified. Gaps became visible. Nathan called me one evening, his voice hesitant. "They asked about the vendor escalation protocol," he said. I couldn't answer. I didn't respond right away. "I didn't know how much you handled," he added. Not until I was the one expected to handle it. I leaned against the kitchen counter, considering the weight of that sentence. "I'm not saying this to make you feel bad," he said quickly. "I just didn't know." "I know," I replied. There was a pause. "I don't think I want to stay," he said finally. That surprised me. "Stay where?" I asked. "In the company," he said. "I inherited something I didn't build, and now I see the cost." I didn't offer advice. I didn't need to. Some realizations have to settle on their own. A few weeks later, my mother sent me a Christmas card. No long message, no emotional appeal, just a line written in careful handwriting. "I hope you are well." That was it. I stared at the card for a long time. Then I placed it in a drawer and closed it. Not because it hurt, because it no longer directed anything inside me. As the year ended, I reviewed my own progress. My consulting work had evolved into something more stable. I wasn't just solving problems anymore. I was helping organizations design structures that didn't rely on invisible labor or unspoken expectations. Clear authority, clear exits, clear accountability. I insisted on those terms. Every time. Some clients walked away. Most stayed. One afternoon, while finalizing a partnership agreement, my new business partner, Rachel Monroe, looked at me and said, "You're unusually calm for someone who's been through what you have." I considered that. "I'm not calm," I said. I'm certain, she smiled. That's better. The certainty came from knowing where I ended and others began. From understanding that being reliable is not the same as being replaceable, and that people who benefit from your silence will always frame it as maturity. Late one evening, I took out my grandmother's note again, the one I kept folded in my desk drawer. You don't need permission to be whole. I thought about how long I'd waited for someone to grant me legitimacy, to say, yes, you matter. Yes, you deserve a say. Yes, we see you. They never did. And yet, here I was, seen by myself, chosen by myself. That was the real reversal of power, not the settlement, not the corrected record, not the sale of the company. The moment I stopped asking to be included and started deciding where I belonged. As the year closed, I made one final decision. I stopped referring to what happened as something that was done to me. It was something I moved through, and the difference between those two perspectives was everything. Because the first keeps you frozen. The second reminds you that you walked out under your own power. The invitation arrived in January, tucked between invoices and meeting confirmations. Its subject line so ordinary, I almost deleted it. Holloway Family Trust. Final administrative review. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. The trust again. Even after the settlement, even after the correction, even after the sale. Some structures take time to dismantle completely, especially the ones built on control. I forwarded it to Samuel with a short note. Do I need to attend? His reply came quickly. Number. This is procedural, but it's symbolic. Your parents will be there. Symbolic. That word carried more weight than it should have. I decided to go, not to reopen anything, not to prove anything, but to see myself in the room without shrinking. The meeting took place in a modest law office across town. No judge, no courtroom. Just a final review of distributions, filings, and confirmations that everything had been executed according to the revised record. When I walked in, my parents were already seated. My mother looked startled to see me. My father stood halfway out of his chair, then sat back down, unsure which version of himself was expected. We nodded to each other. That was it. The attorney, a woman named Karen Lutz, walked through the remaining items with practiced neutrality. Percentages, transfers, signatures already on file. Then she looked at me. Ms. Walker, she said, using my professional name without hesitation. We'll need your confirmation here. She slid a document across the table. It was a simple acknowledgement that I had received the settlement as agreed, that I had no further claims, that I was closing this chapter voluntarily. Voluntarily. I read the page carefully, then signed. The pen felt heavier than usual. When I looked up, my mother was watching me closely. You didn't have to come, she said softly, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. I wanted to, I replied. She nodded. You seem different. I am, I said. So are you. That wasn't an accusation, just an observation. The meeting ended without ceremony. Outside, my father caught up to me in the hallway. Claire, he said, then corrected himself. Walker. I turned. I should have listened, he said. When your mother said you'd eventually understand, I told her you always did. I waited. That wasn't fair, he added. To you. I studied his face. The defensiveness had faded. What remained wasn't remorse exactly. It was recognition. You taught me something, he continued. About authority. I raised an eyebrow slightly. That it only works if people consent to it, he said. I nodded. And consent can be withdrawn. He swallowed. Yes. We stood there for a moment, the past hovering between us, lighter than it had been in years. I hope you're doing well, he said. I am, I replied. I hope you figure out what comes next. That was as close to closure as we were going to get. Later that week, Rachel and I finalized a long-term partnership agreement. Equity split evenly. Decision-making clearly defined. Exit clauses unambiguous. As we signed, she smiled. You're very particular about these things, she said. I learned the hard way, I replied. She nodded. The best way. I wasn't sure about that, but it was effective. Work picked up quickly. We brought on a junior consultant, a woman named Tessa, sharp and observant. During her onboarding, she hesitated before asking a question. What happens if I disagree with you? She asked. I didn't even pause. Then we talk, I said. And if we can't agree, We document it. No one gets punished for clarity here. Her shoulders relaxed visibly. That moment mattered more to me than any contract I'd signed that month. One evening, as winter settled in, I found myself driving past my parents' old neighborhood without meaning to. The house was darker than I remembered. Smaller. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. Because the pull was gone. Not replaced by anger. Replaced by understanding. They hadn't been villains. They had been afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of losing control. Afraid that if they allowed me full authorship, they would have to examine their own choices. Fear doesn't excuse harm. But it explains it. And explanation, I'd learned, doesn't require reconciliation. As the months passed, I stopped rehearsing how I'd explain my past if someone asked. I stopped compressing it into a story that made others comfortable. If people asked, I told the truth plainly. I was excluded. I noticed. I acted. I moved on. Some nodded. Some shifted uncomfortably. That was fine. One night, I received a message from Olivia Chen. I took your advice, she wrote. I documented everything. I hired a lawyer. They didn't expect it. I smiled. Thank you, she added, for saying it out loud first. I set my phone down and sat quietly, letting the weight of that settle. This was the part no one talks about. The way power changes hands quietly. Not through revenge, but through example. The way silence ends, not with shouting, but with one person refusing to carry more than their share. The way tables turn, not because someone flips them, but because someone finally stands up and walks away. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, one thought stayed with me. I hadn't just reclaimed my place. I'd learned how to leave rooms that were never built to hold me fully. And that knowledge, once earned, doesn't fade. The first real quiet came in March. Not the kind that follows exhaustion, but the kind that exists on its own, without explanation. The kind you don't rush to fill. I noticed it one morning while reviewing a contract at my desk. Sunlight across the floor. No background tension. No sense that something was about to go wrong. I paused mid-sentence and realized my shoulders weren't raised. My jaw wasn't clenched. My body had finally caught up to the decision my mind made months earlier. That same week, Rachel asked if I'd consider speaking at a regional leadership forum. Not a keynote, a panel. Small audience. Mostly women who'd been in family businesses, nonprofits, or long-term partnerships that blurred lines until no one knew who owned what anymore. I don't want to be the cautionary tale, I said. She shook her head. You're not. You're the exit strategy. That made me think. I agreed. The forum was held in a modest conference center outside the city. No banners, no hype. Just folding chairs and coffee stations, and people who looked tired in a familiar way. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't tell the whole story. I didn't need to. I talked about patterns, about how favoritism hides behind phrases like, you're more capable, or you don't need it as much. About how being excluded from decisions is often framed as protection. About how silence is praised until it becomes expected. I watched faces change as I spoke. Recognition is quiet, but unmistakable. Afterward, a woman approached me slowly. Late 40s, composed, but tight around the eyes. My parents rewrote their will last Christmas, she said. I found out by accident. I nodded. They said I was too emotional to manage assets, she continued. I believed them. I met her gaze. Until now, she exhaled sharply. Until now. That moment mattered more than the applause ever could have. Later that evening, Nathan called me again. I hadn't heard from him in weeks. I gave notice, he said. At the company? I asked. Yes, he replied. I don't think I should be there. I didn't rush to respond. I thought inheriting something meant it was mine, he continued. But I never earned it. And I never understood it. That's an honest place to start, I said. He was quiet for a moment. I used to think you were difficult, he admitted. Now I think you were just unwilling to disappear. I closed my eyes. I hope you figure out what you want, I said again. I'm trying, he replied. And this time, I believed him. A few days later, my mother emailed me. Not a long message. No emotional framing. Just a request. Would you like the photo albums from Grandma's house? We're downsizing. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Yes, I replied. Thank you. When the box arrived, it was heavier than I expected. Years of images. Birthdays, holidays, quiet moments I'd forgotten. I went through them slowly, not to relive anything, but to recontextualize it. I noticed how often my grandmother stood slightly apart from my parents, how often she watched instead of directing, how often her eyes followed me. That wasn't coincidence. That was recognition. At the bottom of the box, tucked inside an envelope, was a photo I'd never seen before. My grandmother and me, standing in the catering kitchen years earlier. Both of us smiling, mid-conversation, unaware we were being photographed. On the back, in her handwriting, she'd written, "She sees what others avoid." I sat with that for a long time. That night, I made a decision I hadn't planned. I registered a small LLC under my professional name. Not for expansion, for protection. A clean structure, clear ownership, no ambiguity. It wasn't about growth. It was about permanence. Rachel supported it immediately. So did Samuel when I asked him to review the paperwork. "You're building something that can't be quietly taken from you," he said. "Yes," I replied. "That's the idea." As spring turned toward summer, my life continued to widen. Not dramatically, steadily. I traveled for work. I declined invitations that felt performative. I accepted ones that felt grounded. I learned the difference between being included and being valued. One afternoon, while walking home, I passed a bookstore hosting a reading. Through the window, I saw a sign. "Stories that change. Power." I stopped walking. Power doesn't always change through force, I realized. Sometimes it changes through refusal. Refusal to stay quiet. Refusal to be grateful for less. Refusal to carry weight that was never yours alone. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no rehearsals, no mental negotiations, just rest. And in that rest, I understood something fully for the first time. The most lasting revenge isn't watching someone fall. It's building a life they no longer have access to. The moment I knew the story had truly ended didn't come with a phone call or a document. It came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee cooling on the counter, sunlight hitting the same spot on the floor it always did, when my phone buzzed with a notification. A calendar reminder for something that used to rule my life. Holloway Family Annual Planning Meeting. It was an old entry, forgotten. A leftover from a version of myself who planned around other people's expectations. I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I deleted it. No ceremony, no hesitation, just gone. And with it, the final thread loosened. Over the following weeks, nothing dramatic happened. No new confrontations, no apologies that came too late. No surprise revelations waiting to be uncovered. And that was the point. The kind of power I'd reclaimed didn't need constant reinforcement. It didn't depend on someone else acknowledging it. It existed quietly, in the way my days unfolded without tension, in the way my decisions no longer required rehearsal or justification. Rachel and I finalized our second-year projections. Conservative, sustainable, clean. We brought on 2 more consultants, both women who asked direct questions about authority and exit clauses during onboarding. I answered them honestly. "You will never have to earn the right to speak here," I told them. "And you'll never be punished for using it." They believed me because I didn't oversell it. Trust doesn't come from promises. It comes from structure. That summer, I received one final message from my father. It was short. "I understand now why you stepped away. I wish I had understood sooner." I read it once. Then I archived it. Not out of anger, out of completion. Because understanding, when it arrives after the damage is done, doesn't require response. It simply closes a door that no longer needs guarding. Nathan sent a message a few weeks later from a number I almost didn't recognize. "I'm starting something new. Entry level, different industry. No shortcuts." I smiled. "Good," I replied. "Build something that doesn't need excuses." That was it. No advice. No follow-up. He didn't need saving. Neither did I. In early fall, I visited my grandmother's grave alone. No family gathering, no symbolic gestures. Just a quiet moment with someone who had seen me clearly long before I understood myself. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't need to. I stood there and said what I hadn't said before. "You were right. I didn't stay quiet." The wind picked up slightly, lifting the leaves around my feet. I took that as enough. On the drive home, I reflected on how differently the story might sound if someone else told it. They might call it revenge. They might call it a family drama. They might focus on the inheritance, the will, the betrayal, the tables turned. But that wasn't what it had been. Not really. This wasn't about punishing my parents. It wasn't about outmaneuvering my brother. It wasn't even about money. It was about consent. About recognizing the moment when love became control, when inclusion became conditional, when silence was expected as proof of maturity, and choosing, quietly and deliberately, to step out of that contract. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't begged. I hadn't demanded to be chosen. I had chosen myself. That choice didn't make me lonely. It made me honest. If you're hearing this story and recognizing pieces of your own life, I want you to understand something clearly. When you are excluded from decisions that shape your future, that is not protection. When your loyalty is rewarded with less authority, that is not trust. When you are told to be patient while others benefit from your work, that is not love. That is control. And control survives on one thing more than anything else: your silence. You don't need to burn bridges. You don't need to scream. You don't need to prove anything to anyone who has already decided your value for you. Sometimes the most powerful move is paperwork. Sometimes it's calling a lawyer. Sometimes it's changing your name. Sometimes it's walking away and letting the system reveal its own weaknesses once you stop holding it together. Revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like peace. Sometimes it looks like a life no one else gets to manage anymore. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and share your experience. Have you ever been excluded, overlooked, or quietly erased by people who claim to love you? Like the video if it spoke to you. Subscribe if you want more real-life stories about family drama, betrayal, inheritance disputes, karma, and the quiet kind of revenge that doesn't shout but always lands. And remember this: the life you want doesn't exist inside the comfort of being needed. It exists in the courage of choosing yourself.